So welcome back again. In this lesson, we're going to our iOS again. And what we want to do is we want to write the data source for our table view. So we can essentially see something like this so that we can populate the content of it by some values. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I've done is I've opened my main storyboard and I've selected my cell and I've given it an identifier so we know what is the name of that one. In this case, I've called it list cell. You can call it essentially anything as long as you remember that name. So the next thing is adding a data source file. Now, if you have been programming with iOS with Xcode, it's actually a little bit different in here. In here, we have a specific class called UI table view source that takes care of data source and delegate. So I'm going to add that. I'm going to say Command N. And I'm going to add a class called lists data source. Hit new, that's of the type empty C# class. And my list data source is actually going to be a member of UI table view source. If you don't have that, and you most likely won't, you have to use the using UI kit. So because table view source is a member of the UI kit. The moment you make your class a subclass of this one, it would automatically show you that some abstract classes are missing. So you can just right click and say implement abstract class. The UI table view source has so many classes. There are ways to categorize it into sections, know when a cell has been clicked on, delete a cell, so on and so forth. But the ones that they really matter, these are the ones that they have to be there, are these two. How many cells are there, rows in section, and what is in them, get cell. So this is the number of rows in section in iOS terms, and this is the cell for row at index path in iOS terms. So get cell is the cell that you want to see, and the rows is the number of them. I'm actually going to reorder them. I'm going to put this down here. It kind of makes more sense to me. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say we have just a random, a static number, such as in here return 5, just so that we can see some values happening. And for the cell, I'm going to say I have a UI table view cell. Let's call it cell, and that's going to be our table view dot DQ reusable cell using identifier. And the identifier is lists cell, the name that we gave in our storyboard. So lists cell, and then I'm going to say return cell. And in between, I'm going to say cell dot text label dot text is test. This would very well work right now, but before I move on out of this, I want to do a little thing, which is I want to add the view controller where this data source is being called for. So I'm going to say we have a read-only UI view controller, and this one I'm going to call it data sources controller, data source controller, which view controller has called this data source. And then I'm going to say in our initializer, public lists data source, initialize it with a UI view controller. Let's call it input CTRL. And what happens is when this initializer gets called, when the constructor gets called, we're going to say our data source view controller, it becomes the input controller. This is something I'm going to need to use later on, but it kind of makes sense that we add it right now simply because this is the constructor for this class, and we have to if we want to do something, we better do it right away. So now that we have this class and its methods, let me just get here for a second. I'm going to pause the video for a few seconds in here if you want to catch up like this. And then I'm going to move on to the other side where we're going to use this one. If you want to copy from my code, just pause your video. Otherwise, let's move on to our lists view controller. In my lists view controller, I'm going to go to view did load, and in view did load, I'm going to say I have a lists data source. Let's call it table data source, which is going to be a new list data source, and is asking me for an input view controller. This is the input view controller. Again, if you come from a background of iOS in Xcode, this is essentially self. So if it was iOS, if it was Xcode, we would call this self. Here we call it this. And then the next thing is I'm going to say grocery list table view dot source becomes table data source. And that's about that. Let's run this application now. And if it all works, we should be able to see some test values in our groceries application. So once my simulator loads up, we have this. Perfect. Test subtitle. It means that our data source is working fine. However, at the moment we have our data source with some, of course, random basic values. But what we really need to do is we need to understand how our data structure is and how do we actually use our data. That's going to be something that we need to spend several lessons on it. So I'm not going to go through it right now. But for now, it's a good thing that our table is actually working fine. I'm going to categorize my code in here. I'm going to add a new folder, say add folder. I'm going to call this classes. And in the classes, I'm going to have the lists data source in here, simply because these are my own classes. So let's keep it up to here and we'll move on to our next lesson.